My sister's wedding coordinator pulled me aside during the rehearsal dinner, her clipboard pressed against her chest like a shield. "Jessica, I need to be direct with you," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The photographer has been instructed to avoid including you in any formal shots. You'll need to step out of frame during family photos." The words hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd been expecting something like this ever since my sister Vanessa announced her engagement 6 months ago. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I stood there in the hotel ballroom, 28 years old, wearing a bridesmaid dress I'd paid for myself, and realized I was being erased from my own sister's wedding. This wasn't the first time, of course. At my cousin Lauren's wedding 2 years ago, I'd been carefully cropped out of the professional albums. At my brother Marcus's ceremony the year before that, I'd somehow missed every single group photo, always conveniently in the bathroom or fetching someone a glass of water when the photographer gathered the family. Now it was happening again, except this time someone had finally said it out loud. "I don't understand," I managed to say, though that was a lie. I understood perfectly. Did Vanessa actually say this, or is this coming from Mom? The coordinator, a woman named Patricia with kind eyes and an uncomfortable expression, shifted her weight. "The instructions came from your mother, but your sister was copied on the email." "I'm sorry, Jessica." I tried to push back, but they were very clear about their wishes. I nodded slowly, feeling that familiar mixture of humiliation and resignation settle over me like a heavy coat. 28 years of being the family disappointment had taught me not to make scenes, not to demand explanations I already knew. My mother, Eleanor Hartwell, had very specific ideas about how our family should be presented to the world, and I had never quite fit into that carefully curated image. "It's fine," I said, which was what I always said. "I understand." But it wasn't fine, and as I walked away from Patricia's sympathetic gaze, I felt something shift inside me. How many more family events would I attend as a ghost? How many more times would I smile and nod and pretend it didn't hurt to be systematically excluded from the visual record of my own family's history? The rehearsal dinner continued around me with its careful choreography of toasts and laughter. I sat at the end of the table designated for the wedding party, picking at my salmon and watching my mother hold court at the head table. Eleanor Hartwell was a formidable woman in her early 60s, the kind of person who commanded attention simply by existing in a space. She'd built a successful career as an interior designer for wealthy clients, and she applied the same exacting standards to her family that she did to her professionally staged homes. Everything had to be perfect, harmonious, worthy of display. I was none of those things. My crime wasn't anything dramatic or scandalous. I hadn't stolen money or gotten arrested or married someone inappropriate. My transgression was simply that I'd chosen a different path than the one my mother had mapped out for me. Instead of following my siblings into prestigious corporate careers, I'd become a social worker specializing in foster care placement. Instead of marrying a successful professional from our social circle, I was perpetually single, too busy with emergency calls from teenagers in crisis to maintain the kind of relationship my mother could brag about at country club luncheons. "You look like you're planning an escape," a voice said beside me, and I turned to find Vanessa's maid of honor, a woman named Rachel whom I'd met exactly twice before, sliding into the empty chair next to mine. "Just contemplating the salmon," I replied, forcing a smile. "It's very contemplative salmon." Rachel laughed, a genuine sound that made me like her immediately. "I heard about the photo situation," she said quietly. "That's absolutely insane for what it's worth. You're her sister." The unexpected sympathy threatened to crack the careful composure I'd maintained since Patricia's announcement. "It's complicated," I said, which was the response I'd perfected over years of explaining my family dynamics to confused friends and colleagues. "Family is always complicated," Rachel agreed. "But deliberately excluding someone from wedding photos? That's next-level dysfunction." She paused, studying my face. "Have you thought about just leaving? Not showing up tomorrow?" The suggestion was tempting in a way that surprised me. What would happen if I simply didn't appear at Vanessa's wedding? Would anyone besides Rachel even notice my absence? But I shook my head. She's still my sister. I can't miss her wedding, even if I'm not allowed to exist in the photographic evidence that it happened. Rachel looked like she wanted to say more, but movement near the entrance caught both our attention. A man had entered the ballroom, and there was something about his arrival that caused a ripple of awareness through the room. He was probably in his mid-30s, tall and distinguished-looking in a way that suggested old money rather than new wealth. What struck me most was how he paused in the doorway, scanning the room with an intensity that felt almost searching. "Who is that?" I asked Rachel, who had better knowledge of the guest list than I did. She frowned slightly. "I'm not sure. He wasn't at the rehearsal this afternoon." She pulled out her phone and quickly scrolled through something. "Not on my seating chart either. Maybe he's a +1 who didn't RSVP." I watched as my mother noticed the newcomer, her expression shifting through several emotions too quickly for me to identify before settling on something that looked almost like recognition, followed immediately by displeasure. She rose from her seat and made her way toward him with the purposeful stride of someone about to handle an unwelcome situation. From across the room, I couldn't hear their conversation, but body language spoke volumes. My mother stood rigid, her shoulders squared in the defensive posture she adopted when dealing with anything that threatened her carefully maintained control. The stranger remained calm, speaking quietly, his hands making occasional gestures that seemed explanatory rather than confrontational. Whatever he was saying, my mother clearly didn't like it, but she also wasn't making the scene I would have expected. Instead, after several tense minutes, she turned and pointed directly at me. My stomach dropped. What could this stranger possibly have to do with me? He followed the direction of my mother's gesture, and our eyes met across the crowded ballroom. Even from this distance, I could see his expression shift, something like relief or recognition crossing his features. Then he was moving toward me, and my mother was following him, and I had approximately 30 seconds to prepare for whatever confrontation was about to unfold. "Jessica Hartwell?" he asked when he reached my table, his voice carrying a warm depth that didn't match the formal occasion. "Yes," I responded, standing automatically, years of etiquette training kicking in despite my confusion. He extended his hand with a slight smile. "My name is Daniel Morrison. I apologize for the intrusion, but I've been trying to reach you for several weeks. Your mother apparently intercepted my messages." I shook his hand automatically while my brain tried to process this information. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. Why were you trying to reach me?" Before he could answer, my mother arrived, slightly breathless from her hurried walk across the ballroom. "Jessica, this is neither the time nor the place for this discussion. Mr. Morrison, I've asked you to respect our family's privacy during this important celebration." "With respect, Mrs. Hartwell," Daniel said, his tone remaining courteous but firm, "this is exactly the right time and place since it concerns family." He turned back to me, ignoring my mother's sharp intake of breath. "Jessica, I've been researching my family history for the past year, and I've discovered something significant. We're related, you and I. First cousins, actually." The words hung in the air like something tangible. First cousins. But I only had 3 cousins on my mother's side, all of whom were currently sitting at various tables around the ballroom, and my father's family was small and well documented. There was no room in my family tree for a mysterious 30-something cousin I'd never heard of. "That's impossible," my mother said sharply, her composure finally cracking. "Jessica, don't listen to this. He's obviously confused or attempting some kind of con." But something in Daniel's eyes held absolute certainty, and more than that, something that looked almost like compassion. "I have documentation," he said quietly. "DNA results, birth certificates, correspondence. Your mother knows exactly who I am and why I'm here, because I've explained it to her several times over the past month. She's chosen not to share that information with you." I looked at my mother, really looked at her, and saw something I'd rarely witnessed before. Genuine fear beneath the anger. Not fear of scandal or embarrassment, but something deeper and more personal. "Mom," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "What is he talking about?" Eleanor's face had gone pale, and for a moment I thought she might actually faint. Then she seemed to gather herself, that iron control reasserting itself. "Jessica, we are not having this conversation at your sister's rehearsal dinner. Mr. Morrison, I must insist that you leave immediately, or I'll have hotel security remove you." "I'll leave," Daniel said calmly, "but not before giving Jessica this." He pulled a manila envelope from inside his jacket and held it out to me. Everything you need to know is in here. My contact information, the documentation I mentioned, and the full story that your mother has apparently decided you don't have the right to know. I took the envelope with trembling hands, feeling its weight like it contained something far heavier than paper. Around us, I was aware of the rehearsal dinner grinding to a halt, curious faces turning in our direction, the inevitable gossip already beginning to ripple through the assembled guests. "Jessica, give me that envelope right now," my mother commanded, reaching for it. I stepped back instinctively, clutching it against my chest. Something about her desperation to take it from me made it suddenly precious, a key to something I hadn't even known was locked. "No," I said, and was surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "No, I think I need to read this."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Daniel nodded slightly, something like approval in his expression. "I'm staying at the Riverside Hotel downtown, room 412. When you've read the contents, if you want to talk, I'll be available." He glanced at my mother, and there was sadness in his look rather than anger. "I'm sorry this is happening this way, Eleanor. I tried to do this privately to give you the chance to tell Jessica yourself. You chose not to take it." Then he was walking away, moving through the silent, staring crowd with quiet dignity. The ballroom erupted into whispered conversations the moment he disappeared through the door. I stood there holding the envelope, feeling like I'd just been handed a bomb with an uncertain timer. My mother reached for my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Jessica, I need you to trust me. That envelope contains lies and manipulations designed to hurt this family. Throw it away without reading it." I looked down at her hand on my arm, then up at her face. How many times in my life had she asked me to trust her, only to prove that trust misplaced? How many times had she made decisions about what I should and shouldn't know, what I was and wasn't capable of handling? "I'm going to read it," I said quietly, pulling my arm free. "And then I'm going to decide for myself what's true and what's a lie." "If you do this," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper, "if you open that envelope and pursue this ridiculous claim, you will not be welcome at tomorrow's wedding. Do you understand me? You'll be choosing some stranger over your own family." The ultimatum hung between us, and I felt Rachel stand up beside me, a gesture of silent support. Around the ballroom, my siblings and extended family watched the drama unfold with varying expressions of shock, concern, and in some cases, what looked almost like satisfaction at seeing perfect Eleanor Hartwell finally lose control of a situation. "Then I guess I'm making that choice," I heard myself say, and even as the words left my mouth I could hardly believe I was saying them. "Because you've already excluded me from the wedding photos anyway. What's one more absence?" I walked out of that ballroom with my head high and my heart pounding, carrying an envelope that apparently contained the explanation for why I'd never quite belonged in my own family. Behind me, I heard my mother's sharp voice trying to restore order, trying to spin the situation into something manageable, but I didn't look back. In the hotel lobby, I found a quiet corner and sat down in an overstuffed chair that seemed designed for exactly this kind of crisis. My hands shook slightly as I opened the envelope and pulled out its contents. There were several documents, but the top one was a letter written in clear masculine handwriting. "Dear Jessica," it began. "My name is Daniel Morrison and I'm writing to tell you about a woman named Catherine Morrison, who was my mother and, as it turns out, your aunt. This is the story of how your mother's sister disappeared from family history, and how you and I came to exist as cousins who never knew each other." I read those opening lines 3 times before they started to make sense. My mother's sister. But my mother was an only child, had always been an only child. Her parents, my grandparents, had died before I was born, but the family stories had always been consistent. Eleanor was their sole daughter, raised with all the advantages of an upper-class upbringing, educated at the best schools, prepared to marry well and maintain the family's social standing. Except apparently that had been a lie. I kept reading, and with each paragraph, my understanding of my own history shifted and reformed like a kaleidoscope, turning to reveal an entirely different pattern. Catherine Morrison had been Eleanor's younger sister by 4 years. Where Eleanor had been the perfect daughter, Catherine had been rebellious and creative, more interested in art and music than in making suitable connections and maintaining social appearances. Their parents had pushed both daughters toward acceptable marriages within their social circle, but while Eleanor had complied, marrying my father Richard in a ceremony that was apparently the society event of the season, Catherine had fallen in love with someone entirely inappropriate. Thomas Morrison had been a high school music teacher, the son of working-class parents, with no family money and no connections to recommend him. When Catherine announced her intention to marry him, her parents had given her an ultimatum: choose the family or choose Thomas. Catherine had chosen Thomas, and according to Daniel's letter, she had been systematically erased from family history as punishment for that choice. The documents in the envelope supported every claim in the letter. There were birth certificates showing Catherine Morrison as Eleanor's sister. There were wedding announcements from a small ceremony in 1987. There were photographs of two sisters who looked so similar that there was no denying their relationship, even though I'd never seen these images before. And there was a DNA test result, officially certified, showing that Daniel Morrison and Jessica Hartwell shared approximately 12.5% of their genetic material, consistent with first cousins. My mother had a sister. I had an aunt, one who had been deliberately excluded from every family narrative I'd ever heard. And judging by Daniel's letter, Catherine had tried multiple times over the years to reconcile with Eleanor, to be part of her nieces' and nephews' lives, only to be rebuffed at every turn. My mother passed away 8 months ago, Daniel's letter continued, from ovarian cancer. In her final weeks, she talked a lot about her family, about the sister she'd lost to stubbornness and pride. She made me promise to try one more time to build a bridge, not for her sake but for yours. She said she had 4 nieces and nephews she'd never met, and that the greatest regret of her life was allowing her parents' narrow-mindedness to cost her those relationships. She particularly worried about you, Jessica, because your mother had apparently mentioned in one of their few communications over the years that you reminded Eleanor of Catherine, and not in a complimentary way. I set down the letter, my vision blurring with tears. Suddenly, so many pieces of my life made sense. The constant criticism, the feeling that I was never quite good enough, never quite fitting the mold my mother had designed for her children. I hadn't just been the disappointing daughter. I'd been a reminder of the sister my mother had lost, or perhaps more accurately, had chosen to lose. My phone buzzed with incoming messages, a flood of texts from various family members wanting to know what was happening, whether I was okay, what that stranger had said to cause such a scene. I ignored all of them except for one from Rachel. Whatever you decide to do, I think you're incredibly brave. That took guts. I sat in that lobby chair for what might have been 20 minutes or an hour, watching elegantly dressed people come and go, living their normal lives while mine restructured itself around this new information. Then I stood up, smoothed down my dress, and walked to the elevators. The Riverside Hotel was only 3 blocks away. I made the walk in my heels and formal dress, drawing curious looks from evening pedestrians but not caring about appearances for perhaps the first time in my carefully controlled life. At the hotel's front desk, I asked them to call room 412, and when Daniel answered I simply said, "It's Jessica. Can I come up?" He met me at the elevator, and up close I could see features that echoed my own. We had the same slightly crooked smile, the same way of tilting our heads when we were thinking. It was like looking at a version of my own face translated into masculine features, and the recognition was almost overwhelming. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. "I wasn't sure you would." "Tell me about her," I said, not bothering with small talk or social niceties. "Tell me about Catherine. Tell me about my aunt." We sat in his hotel room, which he'd converted into something of a research station, with documents and photographs spread across the desk and credenza. For the next 3 hours, Daniel told me stories about a woman I'd never known, but who had apparently known about me, following my life from a distance through careful internet searches, and the occasional update from more sympathetic extended family members. Catherine Morrison had been an art teacher, working in public schools in neighborhoods most of my mother's social circle would never visit. She and Thomas had been married for 32 years before his death 5 years ago, and by all accounts it had been a genuine love match, the kind of partnership that made their modest lifestyle feel rich in ways that had nothing to do with money. They'd had only one child, Daniel, born when Catherine was in her late 30s, after years of fertility struggles. She never stopped missing her sister, Daniel said, showing me a photograph of Catherine in her 50s, laughing at some unrecorded joke, her face so similar to my mother's that it was jarring. She'd talk about Eleanor sometimes, remembering things from their childhood. How they used to sneak out to watch old movies at the theater downtown. How Eleanor had once wanted to be a writer before their parents convinced her it wasn't a practical career. My mother always said that losing Eleanor hurt more than being disowned by her parents, because her parents' rejection was predictable, but Eleanor's felt like a betrayal. Did she ever try to contact me directly? I asked, touching the photograph gently. Growing up, I mean? Daniel nodded slowly. Once when you were about 7. She sent you a birthday card with a book inside, one of her favorite children's stories. Your mother returned it unopened with a letter threatening legal action if Catherine ever attempted to contact any of her children again. The cruelty of that image hit me hard. My mother, whom I'd always known to be controlling but had never quite thought of as cruel, had denied her dying sister even the smallest connection to the nieces and nephews who might have loved her. More than that, she denied us the chance to know someone who, by all evidence, had been an extraordinary person. Why now? I asked. Why wait until after she died to contact me? Because she made me promise not to while she was alive, Daniel replied. She was afraid that if I reached out, it would only cause problems for you within your family. She didn't want to be the source of conflict in your life, even from a distance. He paused, looking uncomfortable. But after she died, I found letters she'd written but never sent, birthday cards addressed to you and your siblings that she'd kept in a box. She'd followed all of your lives so carefully, Jessica. She knew about your career in social work, and she was so proud of you. She said in one of her letters that you'd become the kind of person she'd always hoped to be. Someone who actually helped people instead of just maintaining appearances. I pressed my hands to my face, trying to contain the emotion that threatened to overwhelm me. A stranger who was my aunt had been proud of me. A woman I'd never met had seen value in the choices that had disappointed my mother. The validation I'd been seeking my entire life from Eleanor had apparently existed all along, just from someone I'd never been allowed to know. There's something else, Daniel said gently. Something I think you need to see. He pulled out a tablet and navigated to a video file. She recorded this about 2 weeks before she died. She knew I'd eventually contact you, and she wanted you to hear this directly from her. He pressed play, and suddenly there was a woman who looked so much like my mother it stole my breath, but softer somehow, with kinder eyes and a gentler smile. She was clearly ill, her head wrapped in a colorful scarf, her face showing the gauntness of aggressive treatment, but her eyes were bright and present. Hello, Jessica. The video began, and I realized I was crying before she'd even finished my name. If you're watching this, then Daniel has finally worked up the courage to find you, and you've been generous enough to listen. My name is Catherine Morrison, and I'm your mother's sister. I'm your Aunt Catherine, though I never got the chance to be that for you in any meaningful way. She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts or perhaps her strength. I don't know what you've been told about me, if you've been told anything at all. Your mother might have erased me from the family history entirely, which would be consistent with Eleanor's approach to uncomfortable truths. But I want you to know that I thought about you often, you and your sister and brothers. I followed your lives from a distance, celebrating your accomplishments and worrying during your challenges, even though I had no right to those feelings given that I was essentially a stranger to you. Catherine smiled then, sad but genuine. Daniel tells me you became a social worker specializing in foster care. That you dedicate your life to helping children who've been displaced from their families. I can't tell you how much that means to me, Jessica. In a way, you've devoted your career to preventing the kind of family separation that happened to me, even though you didn't know my story. I like to think there's something in our shared DNA that pushed you toward healing those fractures. The video continued for another 10 minutes, with Catherine telling stories about her life, about Thomas, about the students she'd taught and the art she'd created. She talked about her relationship with Eleanor before the estrangement, painting a picture of two sisters who had once been genuinely close before family expectations and pride had driven them apart. I want you to know, Catherine said near the end of the video, that I forgave your mother years ago for cutting me out of the family. Forgiveness doesn't mean what she did was right, but it means I stopped letting it poison my life. I built a beautiful existence with Thomas and Daniel, and I had a career that mattered, and I made peace with the choices I made. But I do have one regret. And that's that I never fought harder to be part of your lives, yours and your siblings. I let Eleanor's anger become a barrier I never truly challenged, and that was my failing, not yours. She leaned closer to the camera, her expression intensely earnest. Jessica, if you're anything like the person I think you are based on watching you from afar, you probably struggle with feeling like you don't quite fit in your family. You probably wonder sometimes if there's something wrong with you, some fundamental flaw that makes you different from your mother and siblings. I want to tell you that there's nothing wrong with you. You're exactly who you're supposed to be. And if you're like me, if you're the one who questions the rules and challenges the expectations and insists on following your heart even when it's inconvenient, then that's a gift, not a curse. The video ended with Catherine simply looking into the camera for a long moment, her expression filled with love for a niece she'd never properly known, and then the screen went black. I sat in silence, tears streaming down my face, grieving for an aunt I just discovered and immediately lost. Daniel sat beside me, his own eyes damp, both of us mourning the woman who'd connected us and the family relationships that had been sacrificed to pride and stubbornness. She wanted you to have something, Daniel said after a while, pulling out a small wrapped package. She set this aside years ago, hoping someday she'd get the chance to give it to you herself. Inside the wrapping was a journal, its cover worn with age and use, filled with Catherine's handwriting. A note on the first page read, "For Jessica, when she's old enough to understand. These are the stories of our family, the true ones, not the edited versions. You deserve to know where you come from, all of it, not just the parts deemed acceptable for public consumption." I opened the journal to a random page and found myself reading about my grandmother, Catherine and Eleanor's mother, described not as the dignified society matron of family legend, but as a woman who'd given up her own dreams of becoming a doctor to marry appropriately and produce the next generation of respectable children. The journal was full of stories like that, hidden truths about people I'd thought I knew, complexities and contradictions that made them human, rather than the cardboard cutouts of family mythology. "What are you going to do?" Daniel asked quietly. "About tomorrow's wedding?" I thought about my sister Vanessa, about to walk down the aisle in a ceremony from which I'd already been excluded. I thought about my mother, who'd spent decades maintaining a fiction about her family history. I thought about my brothers and cousins, most of whom probably had no idea that Catherine had ever existed. And I thought about myself, about Jessica Hartwell, who'd spent 28 years trying to fit into a family that had never quite made room for her. "I think," I said slowly, "that I'm going to show up tomorrow exactly as I was planning to. I'm going to wear my bridesmaid dress and stand where I'm supposed to stand. And when they tell me to step out of the family photos, I'm going to very politely refuse." Daniel raised his eyebrows. "That's going to cause a scene." "Yes," I agreed. "It absolutely will. But I'm tired of making myself smaller to accommodate my mother's need for perfect appearances." Catherine stood up for herself and what she believed in, and it cost her everything. The least I can do is stand up for the truth about who our family really is. I stayed at Daniel's hotel room until nearly 2 in the morning, reading through Catherine's journal and looking at photographs of a life I should have been part of. He told me more stories about my aunt, about her students who'd loved her, about the community art projects she'd organized, about the way she'd made their modest apartment feel like a home filled with creativity and warmth. By the time I finally left, I felt like I knew her. This woman whose blood I shared, whose spirit apparently lived on in me. The next morning, I woke up in my own hotel room with a clarity of purpose I'd never experienced before. I put on the bridesmaid dress, did my hair and makeup exactly as Vanessa had requested, and made my way to the venue where the wedding would take place. The ceremony was scheduled for 4 in the afternoon at an elegant estate outside the city, the kind of location that appeared in wedding magazines and cost more than most people's annual salaries. I arrived early, knowing there would be a confrontation before the ceremony even began. Sure enough, my mother found me within minutes of my appearance, her face tight with barely controlled anger. "I didn't think you'd have the audacity to show up after last night," she said, pulling me into a side room away from the other arriving guests and wedding party members. "Vanessa is my sister," I replied calmly. "I wouldn't miss her wedding. Even after I explicitly told you that you weren't welcome if you pursued that man's ridiculous claims?" I met her eyes steadily. "They're not ridiculous claims, Mom. They're documented facts." Catherine Morrison was your sister, my aunt, and you erased her from our family history because she didn't live the life you wanted her to live. Eleanor's face flushed with anger, but underneath it I could see fear. You don't know what you're talking about. Catherine made her choices, and those choices had consequences. She chose a nobody over her family, over everything our parents had built for us. She chose love over social climbing, I corrected. She chose authenticity over appearances. And you punished her for it for the rest of her life. Even when she was dying, even when she reached out one last time, you refused her. What kind of person does that to their own sister? The kind of person who understands that standards matter, Eleanor snapped. That family reputation matters. That we can't just throw away generations of building something meaningful for the sake of momentary passion and artistic delusions. Catherine taught art to inner-city kids for 30 years, I said. She had a marriage that lasted 3 decades and by all accounts was genuinely happy. She raised a son who's successful and kind and who loved her enough to honor her dying wish by finding me. What exactly was meaningless about that life? My mother's expression hardened. This isn't the time for this discussion. Vanessa's wedding is about to start, and I will not allow you to ruin it with your dramatic revelations and accusations. I'm not trying to ruin anything, I said. I just want to be in the family photos. That's all. I want to exist in the visual record of my own sister's wedding. And I've told you that's not possible. Your presence will raise questions, create awkward conversations. This day is about Vanessa, not about you and your need for attention. I took a deep breath, feeling Catherine's courage flowing through me. Here's what's going to happen, Mom. I'm going to stand with the wedding party during the ceremony. I'm going to participate in all the bridesmaid activities I've already paid for and planned for. And when it comes time for family photos, I'm going to be in them. If you want to make a scene about that, if you want to explain to 200 guests why you're physically removing your own daughter from photographs, that's your choice. But I'm done making myself invisible to make your life easier. Eleanor stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between shock and a strange kind of recognition. You really are just like her, she said finally, and it wasn't a compliment. Catherine could never understand the importance of maintaining standards, of presenting the right image. She always had to make everything about her principles and her feelings. Maybe that's not such a bad thing to be, I replied quietly. Maybe caring more about being genuine than about appearances isn't actually a character flaw. Before my mother could respond, Vanessa appeared in the doorway, resplendent in her wedding gown, her expression confused and concerned. What's going on? Mom, why are you in here with Jessica? We're supposed to be starting the pre-ceremony photos in 10 minutes. Eleanor turned to her younger daughter with a smoothness that was almost impressive, her anger disappearing behind a practiced smile. Just having a little chat, darling. Nothing to worry about. You look absolutely stunning. But Vanessa wasn't fooled. She looked between us, her eyes sharp despite the soft romance of her wedding day appearance. This is about last night, isn't it? About that man who showed up at the rehearsal dinner. It's handled, Eleanor said firmly. Everything is under control. Is it? Vanessa asked, and there was an edge in her voice I hadn't heard before. Because last night wasn't exactly under control, Mom. That was actually really embarrassing, having some stranger show up and cause a scene, and you just standing there looking like you'd seen a ghost. I watched my mother's face carefully and saw the moment she made a decision. That man was confused, she said smoothly. He had some mistaken idea about being related to our family, but it was just a case of genealogical confusion. Some people get obsessed with family history and start seeing connections that don't exist. He had documentation, I said quietly. DNA tests, birth certificates, photographs. Catherine Morrison was your sister, Mom. Vanessa's aunt. And you've spent 30 years pretending she never existed. Vanessa's face went very still. What are you talking about? So I told her, right there in that side room while our mother stood frozen with anger, unable to stop the truth from finally spilling out. I told her about Catherine and Thomas, about how our mother had cut her own sister out of the family for marrying someone who didn't meet social standards. I told her about Daniel, about the video Catherine had recorded, about the journal full of family truths that had been carefully hidden. When I finished, Vanessa turned to our mother with an expression I'd never seen on her usually compliant face. Is this true? You had a sister, and you never told us about her. Eleanor's composure finally cracked completely. It was complicated, Vanessa. You don't understand what it was like, the pressure from our parents, the expectations. Catherine's choices would have destroyed everything. So you destroyed her instead, I said quietly. The silence that followed was broken by a knock on the door. The wedding coordinator poked her head in, her professional smile wavering when she saw the tension in the room. I'm sorry to interrupt, but we really need to start the pre-ceremony photos. The photographer is on a tight schedule. Vanessa looked at me, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time in years. Jessica's in all the photos, she said firmly. All of them, including the formal family portraits. Is that clear? Our mother started to protest, but Vanessa cut her off with a raised hand. No, Mom. This is my wedding, and I'm deciding who's in my wedding photos. Jessica is my sister, and she's going to be included in every single shot. If you have a problem with that, you're welcome to excuse yourself from the photographs. Eleanor's face went through several emotions before settling on a tightly controlled neutrality. Of course, darling. Whatever you want. It's your day. But as we filed out toward the formal gardens where the photos would be taken, I caught my mother's eye and saw something new there. Not just anger or disappointment, but perhaps the first glimmer of understanding that her control over this family's narrative was finally slipping away. The wedding ceremony itself was beautiful. Everything Vanessa had planned and dreamed of. I stood with the other bridesmaids, watching my sister marry a man who genuinely seemed to adore her, and for those moments, I let myself simply be happy for her. But when it came time for the family photos afterward, I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, the old instinct to step aside, to make myself small and invisible. Instead, I stood my ground. When the photographer arranged us for the first formal family portrait, I took my place between my brothers, looking directly at the camera with my head held. Hi. My mother stood stiffly on the other end of the lineup, her smile perfect and false. But I was there. I existed. I was part of the family, whether she liked it or not. The reception unfolded with all the elegance and precision my mother had orchestrated over months of meticulous planning. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in ivory linens, centerpieces of white roses and trailing ivy created the romantic atmosphere Vanessa had envisioned, and a string quartet played softly as guests found their assigned seats. I sat at the bridesmaid table, hyper-aware of the curious glances being thrown my way, the whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when I looked in their direction. Word of last night's confrontation had spread through the wedding guests with the predictable efficiency of family gossip networks. Rachel leaned close as we waited for the first course to be served. You're officially the most interesting person at this wedding, she murmured. Half the guests are dying to know what that was all about last night, and the other half are pretending they didn't notice anything unusual happened. I took a sip of champagne, watching my mother work the room with her usual social grace, stopping at each table to accept compliments and ensure everything was proceeding according to plan. To an outsider, she appeared perfectly composed, the successful mother of the bride enjoying her daughter's special day. Only those who knew her well could detect the tightness around her eyes, the slightly forced quality of her laughter. I'm just grateful Vanessa overruled her about the photos, I replied quietly. I was prepared to cause a scene if necessary, but I'm glad it didn't come to that. Rachel studied me with open curiosity. So this mystery cousin who showed up last night, he was telling the truth? Your mom really has been hiding a whole sister from you. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed in my clutch purse. I pulled it out discreetly under the table and saw a text from an unknown number. This is Daniel. I hope today went better than expected. If you want to talk more about Catherine, or if you just need someone who understands complicated family dynamics, I'll be in town for another week. The message made me smile despite everything. In the space of 24 hours, I'd gained a cousin, lost an aunt I'd never known, and discovered that my entire understanding of my family history had been built on carefully maintained lies. It was overwhelming and liberating in equal measure. Dinner progressed through its multiple courses while toasts were made and stories were shared. My brother Marcus spoke about growing up with Vanessa, painting a picture of their childhood that was carefully edited to present only the charming anecdotes, Nothing that might hint at the dysfunction lurking beneath our family's polished surface. My father offered bland pleasantries about welcoming his new son-in-law into the family, his speech so generic it could have applied to any wedding anywhere. When it came time for my mother to speak, Eleanor rose with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to commanding attention. Her toast was a masterpiece of careful presentation, touching on all the expected themes of mothers and daughters, the passage of time, the joy of seeing one's child find happiness. She spoke about the value she tried to instill in Vanessa, the importance of maintaining standards and making choices that would stand the test of time. And as she spoke, I heard the subtext beneath every word, the implicit criticism of Catherine's choices, the justification for cutting her own sister out of family history because she'd chosen love over social acceptability. To my beautiful daughter Vanessa, Eleanor concluded, raising her glass, may your marriage be everything you've dreamed of, and may you always remember that family is the foundation upon which we build our lives. The guests raised their glasses and drank, applauding politely. I lifted my champagne flute but couldn't bring myself to drink, the hypocrisy of that toast too bitter to swallow. Family as foundation, coming from a woman who'd severed half her family tree, and pretended the missing branches had never existed. As the dancing portion of the evening began, I found myself standing near the edge of the reception hall, watching couples spin across the polished floor. Vanessa and her new husband moved together with practiced grace, clearly having invested in dance lessons for this moment. They looked genuinely happy, and I felt a pang of something that wasn't quite envy but perhaps a recognition of possibilities I'd never seriously pursued. At 28, focused on my demanding career and emotionally exhausted by my family dynamics, romantic relationships had always seemed like complications I didn't have bandwidth to manage. "You're thinking very serious thoughts for a wedding reception," a voice said beside me, and I turned to find my brother Lucas standing there with 2 glasses of champagne. He offered me one with a tentative smile. Peace offering for being a complete coward last night when Mom was having her meltdown. I accepted the glass, studying my younger brother. Lucas was 25, working in finance like our father, and had always been the family peacemaker, the one who tried to smooth over conflicts and maintain harmony at any cost. "You don't need to apologize," I said. "I know standing up to Mom isn't exactly easy." He grimaced slightly. "Still should have backed you up. That whole thing with the mystery cousin was wild. Is it true? Mom really had a sister she's been hiding from us." I nodded slowly. "Catherine Morrison. She died 8 months ago. Her son Daniel is the one who showed up last night, trying to connect with the family he never got to know." Lucas let out a low whistle. "That's actually insane. How does someone hide an entire sibling for decades?" "Very carefully," I replied, "and by controlling the narrative so completely that nobody thinks to question it. When did you ever hear Grandma or Grandpa mention having 2 daughters? They collaborated in the erasure, and Mom just continued it after they died." We stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the dancers. Then Lucas said quietly, "You know what the weird thing is? I'm not even that surprised. Does that make sense? Like some part of me always knew there was something off about how Mom presents our family history. Too perfect, too controlled. No messy edges or complicated stories." "Every family has messy edges," I agreed. "We just weren't allowed to acknowledge ours." Marcus joined us then, his face slightly flushed from dancing with his wife. At 32, he was the eldest of us, the one who'd most successfully followed the path our mother had laid out, with his prestigious job at a consulting firm and his marriage to a woman from an appropriately successful family. "So are we talking about the elephant in the room?" he asked without preamble. "Or the ant in the room, I suppose, except she's not actually in the room because Mom systematically erased her from existence?" I couldn't help laughing at his blunt assessment. "I see the champagne is working." "I'm on my 4th glass," Marcus admitted. "Seemed necessary given that I just discovered our family history is basically a fabrication. Did you know about this, Jessica?" "Before last night." "I had no idea," I said. "I knew I didn't fit Mom's vision for what her daughter should be. But I didn't know there was an actual precedent for being cut out of the family for failing to meet her standards." Marcus's expression sobered. "Is that what happened? This Catherine person got disowned for not being the right kind of daughter." I gave them the abbreviated version of Catherine's story, watching their faces shift through shock, confusion, and anger as they processed this new information. When I finished, Lucas said quietly, "So basically, if any of us stepped too far out of line, we could be next?" The question hung in the air between us, uncomfortable in its accuracy. We'd all spent our lives understanding on some level that our mother's love came with conditions, that acceptance into the family required meeting certain standards and maintaining certain appearances. But we'd never quite articulated it so baldly before, never acknowledged that the threat of being erased was always implicit in our family dynamics. "I think," Marcus said carefully, "that we need to meet this Daniel Morrison. If he's our cousin, if his mom was really our aunt, then we have a responsibility to at least acknowledge that relationship." "Mom will lose her mind if we do that," Lucas pointed out. "Probably," Marcus agreed. "But I'm realizing that I'm 32 years old, and I'm still making major life decisions based on whether they'll upset Eleanor Hartwell. That's actually pathetic when I say it out loud." Before we could continue this conversation, our mother appeared, her social smile firmly in place but her eyes hard. "Children, you're being rude, clustering over here instead of mingling with the other guests. Jessica, the groom's uncle, has been asking about your work with foster care. Go be charming." It was a command disguised as a suggestion, the same kind of manipulation she'd been deploying our entire lives. But something had shifted in me since reading Catherine's journal, since watching that video of an aunt who'd seen value in exactly the parts of myself my mother had always criticized. I met Eleanor's eyes steadily. "Actually, Mom, we were having an important conversation about family. You're welcome to join us if you'd like to discuss the topic honestly for once." Her face tightened almost imperceptibly. "This is neither the time nor the place for your dramatic pronouncements, Jessica. Can you please, for once in your life, simply do what's expected without turning everything into a referendum on my parenting?" "I'm not trying to be dramatic," I said evenly. "I'm trying to understand why you cut your own sister out of your life so completely that your children grew up not even knowing she existed." Marcus and Lucas shifted beside me, and I felt their presence as silent support even if they weren't quite ready to vocally challenge our mother themselves. Eleanor glanced around, checking whether nearby guests could overhear us, then stepped closer, lowering her voice to a fierce whisper. "You want to understand? Fine." Catherine was selfish and impulsive. She threw away every advantage our parents had given her, every opportunity they'd created, for a man who couldn't provide for her, who couldn't give her the life she deserved. She chose to embarrass our family, to drag our name through social circles where reputation is everything. And when our parents gave her a chance to correct her mistake, she doubled down and cut them off instead. "That's not what happened," I said quietly. "They gave her an ultimatum. Choose them or choose the man she loved. She chose love and they disowned her for it. Then you continued that punishment for the rest of her life, even when she tried to reconcile, even when she was dying." Eleanor's composure finally cracked, anger flashing openly across her face. "You read that man's propaganda and you think you understand 30 years of complicated family dynamics? You have no idea what it was like, Jessica. The whispers, the judgment, the way people looked at our family after Catherine's disaster of a marriage. I worked for years to rebuild our reputation, to show that the Hartwell name still meant something despite my sister's choices." "The Hartwell name," I repeated softly. "That's what mattered to you? Not your relationship with your sister, not the possibility that she might actually be happy, but how her choices reflected on your social standing." "You say that like it's something shameful," Eleanor snapped. "Reputation matters. Connections matter. The life you're able to live, the opportunities you have, all of that comes from the foundation of respectability that previous generations built." Catherine was willing to throw all of that away. And yes, I refused to let her drag the rest of us down with her. Marcus spoke up then, his voice careful but firm. "But she didn't drag anyone down, Mom. She lived a quiet life teaching art and raising her son. She wasn't causing scandals or bringing shame to anyone. She was just living differently than you wanted her to." Eleanor turned to him with something like betrayal in her eyes. "Not you too, Marcus. I expected this kind of thing from Jessica, she's always been contrary. But I thought you at least understood the importance of maintaining standards." "I do understand it," Marcus said. "I've built my entire career on understanding how appearances and reputation work in professional circles. But there's a difference between maintaining standards and completely erasing someone from your life because they made different choices than you would have made. Before Eleanor could respond, Vanessa appeared, her bride's intuition apparently alerting her to the growing tension in our corner of the reception hall. "What's happening over here?" she asked, her voice carrying a warning note. "Please tell me we're not having another family drama moment at my wedding reception." "We're just having a conversation," I said gently. "I'm sorry, Vanessa. I know this is your day." She looked between us, her expression more knowing than I'd expected. "Is this still about that man from last night? About Mom's secret sister?" When no one immediately answered, she sighed. "I'm not an idiot, you know. I heard what you told me before the ceremony, and I've been thinking about it all day. A whole aunt we never knew about, who apparently wanted to be part of our lives but wasn't allowed to be. That's actually really sad when you think about it." Eleanor reached for her daughter's hand. "Vanessa, darling, you don't need to concern yourself with ancient history. Today is about celebrating your future, not dredging up complicated past situations that have nothing to do with you." "But it does have to do with me," Vanessa said, surprising me with her directness, "because that woman was my aunt and her son is my cousin, and I grew up never knowing either of them existed. That's not ancient history, Mom. That's my family, whether you wanted me to know about them or not." I watched my little sister, whom I'd always thought of as the compliant one, the daughter who'd most successfully pleased our mother, and realized I'd underestimated her. Vanessa had always been good at playing the part expected of her, but that didn't mean she was blind to the dysfunction surrounding us. The moment was interrupted by the band launching into another song, and the wedding planner appeared at Vanessa's elbow to remind her about the cake cutting that needed to happen soon. My mother seized the interruption gratefully, using it as an excuse to guide Vanessa away from our increasingly uncomfortable family discussion. Lucas let out a breath he'd apparently been holding. "Well, that was intense. I need another drink." "Make it 2, Marcus agreed. "Actually, make it 3. I have a feeling we're going to need them." They headed toward the bar, leaving me standing alone again at the edge of the dance floor. I pulled out my phone and found Daniel's earlier message, typing out a response before I could second-guess myself. "Today was complicated but survivable. I'd like to take you up on that offer to talk more. Are you free for coffee tomorrow morning?" His response came within minutes. "Absolutely. There's a cafe called Morning Grounds on 5th Street. 10 o'clock work for you?" I confirmed the time and place, feeling a strange mixture of nervousness and anticipation. In the space of one day, I'd gone from having a clearly defined if unsatisfying family structure to discovering an entire branch of relatives I'd never known existed. Meeting Daniel felt like the next logical step in unraveling 30 years of carefully maintained family mythology. The rest of the reception passed in a blur of obligatory socializing and careful avoidance of my mother, who seemed to have decided that ignoring me was preferable to continuing our earlier confrontation. I danced with Lucas and Marcus, made small talk with distant cousins who kept shooting me curious glances, and tried to simply be present for Vanessa's celebration without letting the weight of recent revelations completely overwhelm me. As the evening wound down and guests began departing, I found myself helping Vanessa gather her things before she and her new husband left for their honeymoon suite. In the bridal suite where she'd gotten ready that morning, surrounded by discarded makeup and empty champagne bottles, my sister looked at me with unexpected seriousness. "I meant what I said earlier," she told me, "about wanting to know the truth about our family. When I get back from the honeymoon, I want you to tell me everything. All the details you learned from that Daniel person. Everything Mom's been hiding." I studied her carefully. "Are you sure? Once you know, you can't unknow it. It changes how you see everything." "I'm sure," Vanessa said firmly. "I've spent my whole life trying to be the perfect daughter, making all the right choices, following all of Mom's rules. And you know what? I'm exhausted. I love my new husband, and I'm happy about getting married, but I'm tired of pretending our family is something it's not. If we have an aunt who got erased from history, I deserve to know about her." Impulsively, I hugged her, feeling closer to my sister in that moment than I had in years. "Okay," I said. "When you get back, I'll tell you everything. I promise." She hugged me back tightly. "Thank you for standing up to Mom today. About the photos, I mean. I know that couldn't have been easy. It was terrifying. I admitted. But also kind of liberating. I've spent so long trying to fit into her vision of what I should be. And I'm finally realizing that I'm never going to succeed at that. I'm always going to be the disappointing daughter who's too much like Catherine. Vanessa pulled back, looking at me seriously. From what little you've told me about her, being like Catherine doesn't sound like such a bad thing. She followed her heart and lived authentically, right? Maybe that's not a character flaw. Her words echoed what Catherine herself had said in that video, and I felt tears prick my eyes. When did you get so wise? Probably around the time I realized that planning a wedding to Mom's exact specifications was making me more stressed than excited, Vanessa said wryly. Turns out, trying to live up to Eleanor Hartwell's standards is a full-time job with no vacation days. After Vanessa left with her new husband amid a shower of rose petals and well wishes, I made my own exit, slipping out a side door to avoid any final confrontation with my mother. The night air was cool and refreshing after hours in the crowded reception hall, and I stood for a moment in the estate's gardens, letting the silence wash over me. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. You disappeared before I could say goodbye. Just wanted to tell you that you handled today like an absolute champion. Your mom is terrifying and you didn't back down once. Respect. I smiled at the message, typing back a quick thank you. It was strange to realize that people had been watching my small acts of rebellion, that my decision to stand in those photos had registered as significant to someone outside my immediate family. I'd spent so long thinking of myself as invisible, the forgettable middle child who could be easily excluded, that it hadn't occurred to me that maybe I'd been visible all along, just not in the ways I'd been looking for. The drive back to my hotel took me through quiet streets, past houses where families were probably having their own dramas and revelations, their own complicated relationships with truth and history. I thought about Catherine, about how she must have felt when her own family turned their backs on her for choosing love over social acceptability. Had she regretted her choice in those early years, when the reality of being cut off from everyone she'd known must have been devastating? Or had Thomas's love been enough to compensate for the loss of her birth family? According to Daniel's letter and the video I'd watched, Catherine had made peace with her choices and built a fulfilling life despite the rejection she'd experienced. But I wondered about the cost of that peace, the price she'd paid in terms of relationships with nieces and nephews she'd never gotten to know, family celebrations she'd been excluded from, the simple everyday connections that get severed when someone is systematically erased from family history. Back in my hotel room, I changed out of my bridesmaid dress and into comfortable pajamas, then settled into bed with Catherine's journal. I'd only read a few pages the night before, but now I had time to really dive into her words, to understand the woman whose story had been hidden from me my entire life. The journal spanned several decades, beginning when Catherine was a teenager, and continuing almost until her death. Early entries showed a girl who was creative and passionate, who loved art and music and felt constrained by her parents' expectations for appropriate behavior. She wrote about her sister Eleanor with a mixture of affection and frustration, describing someone who seemed content to follow the rules, but who Catherine suspected might harbor her own secret doubts about the life they were being groomed for. Eleanor is so good at being what they want. One entry from Catherine's 16th year read, Sometimes I envy her that ability to just accept things as they are. But other times I look at her and wonder if she's actually happy or just very good at pretending. I think I'd rather be unhappy and authentic than content and fake. As the journal progressed, the entries documented Catherine's growing awareness that she was fundamentally different from her family, that the values they held most dear felt hollow to her. She wrote about discovering art as a passion, about teachers who encouraged her creativity, about the gradual realization that the life her parents envisioned for her would feel like a prison. Then came the entries about Thomas. They met at a community theater production where Catherine was painting sets and Thomas was serving as musical director. The way she described their first conversation made me smile despite the sadness of knowing how the story would end. He asked me about the color choices I was making for the backdrop, and instead of the polite small talk I expected, we ended up having this amazing discussion about how visual art and music both work to create emotional resonance. He sees the world the way I do, like everything is connected, like beauty matters more than status. I read through their courtship, Catherine's growing certainty that Thomas was the person she wanted to build a life with, and then the devastating moment when she told her parents about the relationship. Mother actually laughed, Catherine wrote. She thought I was joking, that I couldn't possibly be serious about a music teacher with no family connections and no money. When she realized I was serious, the laughter stopped and the ultimatums began. The entry describing her final conversation with Eleanor before the estrangement was particularly painful. I asked Eleanor to stand with me, to help me make mother and father understand that love should matter more than social position. She looked at me with what I swear was genuine sadness and said, "I can't choose you over them, Catherine. I'm sorry, but I just can't." I realized in that moment that my sister's compliance with their expectations goes deeper than I'd understood. She's not just playing a part. She genuinely believes in the importance of everything I'm rejecting. After her marriage to Thomas, the journal entries took on a different quality. There was grief for the family she'd lost, anger at the unfairness of being forced to choose between love and familial acceptance, but also growing joy as she built a life with Thomas. She wrote about teaching her first art class, about the satisfaction of helping students discover their own creativity, about the small apartment they'd made into a home. Thomas asked me today if I regret my choice. One entry from a few years into their marriage read, I told him the truth. I regret that my family couldn't accept my choice, but I don't regret the choice itself. Every day with him feels more real and meaningful than any life I could have had trying to meet mother and father's standards. I just wish Eleanor could understand that happiness doesn't have to look like what we were taught to expect. The references to Eleanor became less frequent over time, though Catherine never stopped hoping for reconciliation. Every few years, there would be an entry documenting an attempt to reach out, a letter sent that went unanswered, a birthday card returned unopened. The pain in those entries was palpable, the longing for connection with the sister she'd been close to as a child never quite fading. When Catherine wrote about her pregnancy with Daniel, the joy was tempered with sadness that her sister would never meet her nephew. I wanted to call Eleanor and tell her the news, she wrote. For a moment I thought maybe a baby would be the bridge we needed, that surely she'd want to know her nephew. But Thomas reminded me that I've tried that kind of reaching out before, and it's only led to more hurt. Still, I can't help imagining what it would be like if we could share this happiness. Later entries documented Catherine's career as a teacher, the students whose lives she touched, the art projects she initiated in underfunded schools. She wrote about Thomas's own career, his dedication to his students, the music programs he fought to preserve when budget cuts threatened them. Together, they seemed to have built exactly the kind of meaningful life Catherine had envisioned, one based on genuine values rather than social performance. But the entries about Eleanor and the family she'd lost never completely disappeared. Even decades later, Catherine would occasionally write about her sister, wondering what her life had been like, whether she was happy, what kind of mother she'd become. I think about Eleanor's children sometimes. One entry from about 15 years ago read, I have nieces and nephews I'll never meet, cousins Daniel will never know. It's a strange kind of grief mourning relationships that never had a chance to exist. Near the end of the journal, as Catherine's illness progressed, the entries became more philosophical. She wrote about making peace with her choices, about forgiveness and regret, about the life she'd lived and the relationships she'd lost. I forgive Eleanor, she wrote in one of her final entries, not because what she did was right, but because holding on to anger about it has cost me more than the original estrangement did. She made her choice 30 years ago, and I made mine, and we both have to live with the consequences. My only real regret is that our children paid the price for our stubbornness. I closed the journal as dawn light began seeping through the hotel room curtains, my eyes burning from hours of reading and crying. Catherine Morrison had been an extraordinary person, someone who'd chosen authenticity over comfort, who'd built a meaningful life despite being rejected by her birth family, who'd never stopped hoping for reconciliation even when that hope seemed futile. And she'd been systematically erased from our family history, reduced to a non-person because she'd had the audacity to choose love over social acceptability. The unfairness of it made me angry in a way I'd rarely allowed myself to feel. My mother had robbed us of knowing this remarkable woman, had denied Catherine the joy of watching her nieces and nephews grow up, had let pride and social ambition override basic human connection. And for what? To maintain a fiction of family perfection that was hollow at its core? I must have dozed off despite my racing thoughts, because the next thing I knew my phone alarm was chiming, alerting me that I had an hour before my meeting with Daniel. I showered and dressed quickly, choosing casual clothes that felt like armor against whatever emotional revelations today might bring. Morning Grounds turned out to be a cozy cafe with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls, exactly the kind of place Catherine probably would have loved. Daniel was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 coffee cups in front of him. He stood when he saw me, and again I was struck by the family resemblance, the features we shared that testified to our biological connection. "I wasn't sure how you take your coffee," he said after we'd exchanged awkward greetings. "So I got you a latte but can absolutely get something else if you prefer." "Latte's perfect," I assured him, settling into the chair across from him. For a moment we just looked at each other, 2 cousins who should have grown up knowing each other, attending family gatherings together, sharing the easy familiarity of extended family. Instead, we were strangers connected by DNA, and a shared legacy of family dysfunction. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Daniel said finally. "I wasn't sure you would, after everything that happened at the wedding." "The wedding was actually fine," I said. "Complicated but fine. My sister ended up overruling our mother about the photos, so I was included after all." Daniel smiled, genuine pleasure in his expression. "Mom would have been happy about that. She always hoped you and your siblings would eventually know the truth, and maybe be brave enough to push back against the erasure." "I read her journal," I told him. "The whole thing, cover to cover, stayed up all night reading. Daniel, your mother was an incredible person. The way she wrote about her life, her values, her love for your dad and for you. It's all so honest and beautiful and heartbreaking." His eyes grew damp. "She was pretty special. I'm obviously biased, but I genuinely believe she was one of the best people I've ever known. The fact that her own family couldn't see that they threw her away like she was disposable, it's something I've struggled to understand my whole life." We spent the next 2 hours talking, sharing stories about our respective childhoods, the ways Catherine's banishment had shaped both our lives even though I'd been unaware of it. Daniel told me about growing up knowing he had an extended family that wanted nothing to do with them, about his mother's careful explanations of why he'd never meet his aunt and cousins, about the weird isolation of being erased from a family tree. "Mom never spoke badly about Eleanor," he said. "Even when I was angry about the situation, even when I wanted to hate the aunt who'd rejected us, Mom would remind me that Eleanor had made her choice under enormous pressure from their parents, and that holding on to anger wouldn't help anyone. She was probably a better person than I am, because I definitely hold some resentment about the whole thing." "You're entitled to that resentment," I said. "Your mother tried to reconcile multiple times, even when she was dying, and my mother refused every time. That's cruel by any reasonable standard." Daniel nodded slowly. "The thing is, I don't think your mom is actually a cruel person. From everything Mom told me, Eleanor was kind as a kid, protective of her younger sister, genuinely caring. I think the cruelty came from fear, from being so invested in meeting expectations and maintaining appearances that she couldn't risk stepping outside those boundaries, even for someone she loved." His assessment was uncomfortably perceptive. I'd spent my life thinking of my mother as controlling and demanding, but I'd never quite framed it as fear before. Fear that deviation from acceptable standards would lead to rejection. Fear that authenticity would cost everything she'd built. Fear that love might not be enough to compensate for lost status. "That doesn't excuse what she did," I said. "Understanding the motivation doesn't make the action okay." "No, it doesn't," Daniel agreed. "But it maybe helps explain how someone could maintain such a complete erasure for so long. If she'd allowed even a crack in that wall, if she'd acknowledged Catherine even once, it would have meant admitting that maybe their parents had been wrong, maybe the social standards they'd enforced were harmful, maybe she'd chosen the wrong path. That's a hard thing to face after 30 years of commitment to a particular worldview." I sipped my latte, processing this perspective. "You're very generous in your interpretation of someone who systematically excluded your mother from family life." "I've had a lot of therapy," Daniel said with a slight smile. "And honestly, I think I got the better deal in the parent lottery. My mom was present and loving and encouraged me to be whoever I wanted to be. From what you've told me, growing up as Eleanor's daughter sounds pretty exhausting." "It has its challenges," I admitted. "I've spent my entire life feeling like a disappointment because I didn't want the things she wanted for me. Now I'm realizing that what I was actually doing was being too much like Catherine, which my mother couldn't tolerate because it reminded her of everything she'd given up to maintain her perfect image. Daniel leaned forward, his expression serious. Jessica, I want you to know something. My mom talked about you more than any of her other nieces or nephews. She followed your career, read articles about the foster care programs you've worked on, collected news clippings about your advocacy work. She was so proud of you even though she'd never met you. She saw in you the same values she tried to live by, the same commitment to helping people rather than just maintaining appearances. The revelation hit me harder than I'd expected, tears spilling over before I could stop them. A stranger who was my aunt had been proud of me, had followed my career from a distance, had recognized value in the choices that had disappointed my mother. It was the validation I'd been seeking my entire life, just from a source I'd never known existed. I wish I'd known her, I said when I could speak again. I wish my mother hadn't been so stubborn and prideful that she couldn't let us have a relationship with Catherine. Me too, Daniel said quietly. But we can't change that. What we can do is make sure she's not erased anymore, at least not from our lives. You and your siblings, you deserve to know Catherine's story, to understand that there's another way to be a Hartwell besides the one your mother has insisted on. We talked more about practical matters then, about the rest of my siblings and whether they might be interested in connecting with Daniel, about Catherine's possessions and whether there were things I might want to have as mementos of the aunt I'd never known. He showed me more photographs on his phone, images of Catherine at different ages with Thomas teaching her art classes, simply living her life. In one photo, Catherine must have been around my current age, standing in front of a mural she'd helped her students paint. Her smile was genuine, her eyes bright with satisfaction, and I could see the family resemblance so clearly. She had my mother's basic bone structure but a warmth in her expression that Eleanor never quite achieved, as if the permission to be herself had made her beautiful in a way that careful grooming and expensive clothes couldn't replicate. Can I ask you something potentially uncomfortable? Daniel said after a pause in our conversation. At this point, I think we've crossed the threshold for uncomfortable questions, I replied with a slight smile. What are you going to do now? About your relationship with your mother, with your family? Because I'm guessing that knowing the truth about Catherine is going to change how you see everything. It was the question I'd been avoiding thinking about directly, even though it had been lurking in the back of my mind since the moment I'd opened that envelope at the rehearsal dinner. I don't know, I admitted. Part of me wants to completely cut ties, to just walk away from all the dysfunction and manipulation. But they're still my family, and it's not like everyone is equally culpable for what happened to Catherine. Vanessa and my brothers didn't know about any of this. Even my father might not have known the full story. And the other part of you? Daniel prompted gently. The other part of me thinks maybe I can do what Catherine couldn't, find a way to exist in the family while also refusing to accept the erasure and the pretense. Maybe I can be the crack in the wall you mentioned, the person who insists on truth even when it's uncomfortable, who models a different way of being a Hartwell. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. That sounds exhausting but also very much in line with what I know about you from Mom's observations. She always said you seemed like someone who'd fight for what was right, even when it cost you personally. We parted ways with plans to meet again before he returned home, exchanging contact information and promising to stay in touch. As I walked back to my hotel, I felt lighter despite the emotional weight of everything I'd learned. I had a cousin now, a connection to the family that had been hidden from me, and through him, a link to an aunt who'd believed in me from afar. Back in my room, I found multiple text messages waiting. One from Vanessa, sent from her honeymoon, simply saying, "When I get back, we talk about everything. Love you." One from Marcus asking if I wanted to get dinner sometime this week. One from Lucas with a link to a news article about a man who discovered he had 17 secret half-siblings through DNA testing, accompanied by the message, "Our family drama suddenly seems almost reasonable in comparison." And one from my mother, terse and formal, "We need to discuss your behavior at the wedding and your plans regarding this Morrison situation. Lunch on Tuesday." I stared at that last message for a long time, considering whether to respond, what to say if I did. Part of me wanted to refuse, to simply ghost her the way she'd ghosted Catherine for 30 years. But another part, the part that had been strengthened by reading Catherine's journal and meeting Daniel, recognized that running away wouldn't solve anything. If I wanted to change the family dynamics, if I wanted to be the crack in the wall, I needed to engage even when it was difficult. I typed out a response. Tuesday lunch works. But I'm not discussing my plans regarding Daniel. He's my cousin, Catherine was my aunt, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise to make you comfortable. I sent it before I could second-guess myself, then immediately turned off my phone, not wanting to see whatever response she might fire back. For the rest of the day, I tried to simply be present, taking a long walk through the city, stopping at a small art gallery that seemed like the kind of place Catherine would have appreciated, allowing myself to just exist without constantly processing the revelations of the past 48 hours. That evening, as I packed my things to check out of the hotel the next morning, I found myself thinking about the woman I'd been just 2 days ago, that Jessica Hartwell had felt invisible, systematically excluded from her own family's visual history, unsure of her worth because she'd spent so long being measured against impossible standards. The woman I was becoming had an aunt who'd believed in her, a cousin who'd crossed social boundaries to find her, and a growing understanding that the problem had never been with her at all. The problem had been with a family system that valued appearances over authenticity, that erased inconvenient truths rather than acknowledging complexity, that demanded conformity as the price of belonging. And while I couldn't change that system single-handedly, I could refuse to participate in it. I could insist on truth even when it was unwelcome. I could honor Catherine's memory by living with the same kind of authenticity she'd modeled, even when it cost her everything. Tuesday's lunch with my mother took place at her favorite restaurant, an establishment where the servers knew her by name and the clientele consisted entirely of people from her social circle. I arrived deliberately casual in jeans and a sweater, refusing to dress up for what would inevitably be a difficult conversation. Eleanor was already seated when I walked in, her posture rigid with disapproval as she took in my outfit. "You couldn't have dressed appropriately?" she asked instead of greeting me. "This is appropriate for lunch," I replied, settling into my chair. "What did you want to discuss?" She set down her menu with precise movements. "I want to understand what you think you're accomplishing by pursuing this connection with Daniel Morrison. You're validating his mother's choices, encouraging family discord, and frankly embarrassing me in front of everyone who attended the wedding." "Catherine's choices don't need my validation," I said calmly. "She chose love and authenticity over social performance, and she built a good life. The only person who should be embarrassed is you, for cutting your own sister out of your life and lying to your children about her existence for 3 decades. Eleanor's face flushed. "You don't understand the context, the pressures I was under, the expectations that shaped those decisions. It's easy to judge from your position of comfortable distance, but you weren't there." "You're right, I wasn't there," I agreed. "Because you systematically erased Catherine from our family history. But I've read her journal now. I've heard her side of the story. And I've met the cousin you kept from us. So maybe my judgment isn't as uninformed as you'd like to think." We sat in tense silence while the server took our orders. Then Eleanor leaned forward, her voice dropping. "What do you want from me, Jessica? An apology? Permission to continue this ridiculous connection with a stranger who shares some DNA? What would satisfy you?" "I want you to acknowledge the truth," I said. "I want you to stop pretending Catherine never existed. I want my siblings to be able to know their cousin without fearing your disapproval. And eventually, though I'm not holding my breath, I'd like you to recognize that your need for perfect appearances has cost this family actual meaningful relationships." Eleanor sat back, something shifting in her expression. For a moment she looked older, tired in a way I'd never noticed before. "If I could go back and make different choices, I'm not sure I would," she said quietly. "That probably makes me a terrible person in your eyes, but it's the truth. The life I've built, the stability I've created, it all required certain sacrifices." "Catherine was a person, not a sacrifice," I replied. "And your children deserve to know their aunt." Our food arrived, providing a temporary reprieve from the intensity of our conversation. We ate in uncomfortable silence, years of mother-daughter dynamics preventing either of us from simply walking away. Finally, Eleanor spoke again. "I won't forbid you from maintaining contact with Daniel Morrison. You're an adult and I recognize that I can't control your choices. But I also won't participate in any family gatherings that include him. Is that clear?" It wasn't the acknowledgement I'd hoped for, but it was something. A recognition that her control over the family narrative was slipping, that I was claiming the right to make my own decisions about family relationships. That's your choice to make, I said. Just like it was Catherine's choice to marry Thomas, and your choice to cut her off for it. We all live with the consequences of our decisions. After lunch, I walked to my car feeling strangely liberated. The conversation hadn't resulted in any dramatic reconciliation or sudden maternal enlightenment, but I'd stood my ground. I'd refused to pretend, to minimize, to accept her version of family history as the only truth. Over the following weeks, I introduced Daniel to Marcus, Lucas, and eventually Vanessa when she returned from her honeymoon. Each of them responded differently to learning about Catherine and meeting the cousin they'd never known existed. Marcus was angry, feeling betrayed by the decades of deception. Lucas was more philosophical, treating it as an interesting puzzle piece in understanding family dysfunction. Vanessa cried when she watched Catherine's video, mourning an aunt she'd never gotten to know. We started having monthly dinners, the five of us, building the cousin relationships that should have existed all along. Daniel shared stories about Catherine, showed us photographs and artwork she'd created, helped us understand the woman who'd been erased from our history. And gradually we began creating new family memories, ones that honored Catherine's legacy by refusing to participate in her erasure. My mother never joined these gatherings, maintaining her decision to exclude herself rather than acknowledge Daniel's existence. My father attended once, uncomfortable but willing, and admitted he'd known about Catherine but had deferred to Eleanor's handling of the situation. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was an acknowledgement. 6 months after that rehearsal dinner that changed everything, I stood in a gallery showing Catherine's artwork. Daniel had arranged the exhibition as a memorial to his mother, displaying decades of her paintings and student collaborations. The opening was well attended, a mixture of her former students, fellow teachers, and community members whose lives she'd touched. And there, standing in front of a vibrant abstract piece Catherine had created near the end of her life, was my mother. She'd come alone, slipping in quietly as if hoping not to be noticed. I watched her study the painting, watched emotions flicker across her carefully controlled face, watched her finally allow herself to acknowledge the sister she'd lost. I walked over slowly, standing beside her without speaking. After a long moment, Eleanor said quietly, "She was always the better artist. Even as children, her drawings had something mine lacked. Life maybe. Authenticity. She wanted you in her life," I said gently. "Until the very end, she hoped you'd reconcile." Eleanor nodded slightly, still not looking at me. "I know. I received every letter she sent over the years. I read them all. I just never responded. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was an admission. An acknowledgement that she'd made choices, that those choices had consequences, that Catherine had never stopped reaching out even when those attempts were rebuffed. We stood together in front of Catherine's painting, mother and daughter united temporarily by grief for a woman one had known and lost, and the other had never gotten to know at all. It wasn't healing, not yet, but it was something. A beginning, perhaps, of a different kind of family story. Daniel found us there eventually, his surprise at seeing Eleanor quickly masked by cautious courtesy. She turned to him, really looked at him for the first time, and I saw her recognize the family resemblance, the features that connected him undeniably to our shared bloodline. "You have her eyes," Eleanor said finally. Catherine always had the most expressive eyes. It wasn't much, just a handful of words acknowledging connection and loss. But from Eleanor Hartwell, who'd spent 3 decades denying her sister's existence, it felt like progress. As the exhibition continued around us, I thought about how family stories get written and rewritten, how truth can be buried but never completely erased, how sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply refuse to participate in the pretense. Catherine Morrison had lived authentically despite the cost. The least I could do was ensure her story was finally told, that she existed not just in hidden journals and forbidden photographs, but in the memories and connections of family who finally knew her name. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.